We left off Genesis 21, but we need to do a little bit of review to get back to Genesis 22, this pivotal story that ties together so many themes that will be really important for developing throughout the rest of the Bible. And so, remember what the deal is, that God narrows down from Genesis 1 to 11. He's still tracing forward the seed promise from Genesis 3. There's still the hope of the seed to crush the head of the serpent. That's narrowed down to the family of who? Genesis 12. A trick question. Narrows down to who's promised seed in Genesis 12. Yeah.
Jacob?
Well, yes, eventually, but his grandfather, yeah. Abraham, yeah. Yes, it will be through Jacob, and it does further narrow through there. But yeah, Genesis 1 through 11 is broader, and then we get down to Genesis 12, where it says, okay, this one family is going to have this controlling covenant that's going to impact the whole world, all the families of the earth. And it's going to be through this covenant that God is going to, and others, we'll see in other places in Scripture, through this covenant that God is going to make the world right, restore blessing, and reverse the curse. Okay, we haven't seen how that's going to happen yet. We've just seen the promise been made. And so what are and it's easy to look and see, but what are the three elements of the Abrahamic covenant? That'll be Sophia?
Land, seed, and nation, and blessing.
Okay, land, seed, and blessing, are the three. And then seed, remember, it can be singular, can be down to one person, like the seed of the woman is talked about. And sometimes in Genesis, there will be reaffirmation of this, where it will talk about seed as one person who will represent the group, but it also means the group, Abraham's offspring. They will become a larger family and eventually grow into a nation. And then remember, that nation is supposed to have an international impact. That nation is supposed to be the nation through whom all the other nations are blessed, coming down to the one individual who can represent them all, the seed of the woman, right, Christ. Okay, they're given a land, they will be given a land, the repeat of the Garden of Eden, and this will be the land of Canaan, and Abraham doesn't really own that land during his lifetime, and neither do his descendants. He owns pieces of it, but he doesn't really see this promise come to happen, okay? And so Israel will be given this land, and this will be kind of like a new Garden of Eden in a sense, that like God gave Adam and Eve, that land, that Eden that was going to be the garden, the capital. This land is going to be kind of standing in as that, okay? Now, Abraham does not live to see this, and they don't even enter the land until the time of Joshua. So there's a longer time schedule here. But through these things, God is going to use Abraham's family, Abraham's seed, and the land to bless all the families of the earth. Now, we're not told how that's going to work out yet, okay? But that is what God has declared to Abraham. Abraham does believe. He does go when God calls him to go. Okay, remember Genesis 12:1, he says, go forth, right? He repeats that basically in Genesis 22, go forth. So there's these two kind of bookends of Abraham's development and Abraham's faith. Okay, we also talked about that Abraham, through Genesis 12 through 22, is given opportunities for testing to bring what key value to maturity? That's going to be the main idea, the founding principle for Israel. Yeah, faith. Yep. That faith is going to be, Abraham's the father of faith. He's the representative of faith. He, in the narratives from Genesis 12 all the way through, culminating into what we're looking at today in Genesis 22, God gives Abraham tests of his faith. And Abraham has to realize he does not contribute anything God has to do it all. That's the nature of faith. So we have now, early on, a definition of faith in the Bible. And I emphasized to you guys, and I'm going to continue to re-emphasize, that faith, or Abraham believes God, is credited him as righteousness, or trust. It is not a work that someone is doing. That's not what biblical faith is. Faith is a response to God doing it all. It's a trust, it's a surrender, recognizing that only God can accomplish this. I can't contribute anything. Faith is it's a negative in that sense. It's saying I do 0%. I need to trust that God has to do it all. And so that's what Abraham is learning. But we see that Abraham kind of tries to solve things or do things in his own way. He does in Genesis 13, he leaves the land. In Genesis 14, he rescues Lot. Lot, in Abraham's mind, is kind of like, if God doesn't give me a son, Lot can kind of be my plan B, my backup plan. But he rescues Lot. He meets Melchizedek, who is the representative of the king that is needed, that will come in the future. And so his faith continues to grow. He tells Pharaoh 2 different times, well, this Sarah's not my wife, she's my sister. That impedes the seed promise. God brings curses on those nations. And God has to rescue Abraham, and every time Abraham comes back, he realizes, unless God had gotten me out of this and brought me back, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. Okay? Now, in a couple other ways, Abraham has not received these promises, and Abraham dies without really getting these promises fulfilled. Okay? Except one thing, and that's going to be the birth of Isaac. He doesn't have the land. He doesn't see the blessing on the nations, all the families of the earth. He doesn't even at this point have a son. Okay? So Abraham tries to his credit, make the promises of God come true, but he wants to kind of control and say, okay, God has said this, maybe I can kind of work it so that what God has said will come to pass, but not, maybe I can interpret it a little bit differently. So what are some of the ways that Abraham tries to kind of reinterpret God's promise of a son through him, or tries to get around that? Yeah.
Having a son with Hagar.
Okay, yeah. Genesis 16, he has a son with Hagar based on Sarah, and he coming up with this idea. And Hagar tells him or Sarah tells him to say, hey, wait a second. Okay, you can have a son with Hagar. It will be from your body. It will technically be our son. He'll be adopted. He'll be your heir. But that's not what God said. And it talks about in Genesis 16:2 that Abraham, like Adam, listened to the voice of his wife and he sinned. Right? He tried to get around God's promise. And then what's another way? Sophia?
I was going to say the same thing.
Okay, same thing? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Now there's another way that Abraham, probably not as memorable, but there's another way Abraham tries to get around God's promise of having a son directly through him. What's the other way? Yeah.
Have a son with his servant or her servant.
Well, that's 16, but there's another way that he does. He tries to go around it. Less, like I said, it's not sinful. He just tries to come up with an idea of saying, well, maybe I could do this instead of having a son directly. Yeah.
Well, instead of it being from like his body or whatever, he was thinking that like Lot could be like his like adopted.
Okay, yeah. So he thought that kind of with Lot, but he also thinks it with this guy who is a servant, Eliezer. He says, okay, well, he's born in my house. He can stand in for me. So no, but he's thinking that with Lot as well. That's why one of the reasons probably why he rescues Lot in Genesis 14, because Lot may be kind of his backup plan. But Eliezer grows up in his house, so he says, maybe I'll adopt him as my heir. He'll receive everything if I die. And that's how he'll fulfill the promise. And God says, no, it will be through your own body. Then in Genesis 16, he says, okay, well, just because it's through my own body doesn't necessarily mean it has to be through Sarah's body. And then God says, no, it will be through you and Sarah. And then Genesis 17, God gives him the sign of circumcision, reaffirms the covenant to him. Genesis 18, God shows up with the two angels and tells Abraham, you've got 1 year. Isaac, your son, not Isaac yet, your son will be born in 1 year. Sarah overhears this, and how does she react?
She laughs.
She laughs. And Isaac means what?
Laughter.
Laughter. Yeah, so Isaac is named that. She's having a hard time believing that. Now God goes and the angels go and they judge Sodom and Gomorrah. They rescue Lot. And eventually in Genesis 21, Isaac is born. Okay, and then how many years did Abraham have to wait about to have this promise fulfilled? Yeah. 25 years. So he's waited a long time, and he has not seen these other promises fulfilled, but now he and Sarah have actually had a son in their old age. They have not done it their own way. They've grown in faith, and they have been able to reproduce with the help of God, where they could not have done it themselves. Okay, it says in Hebrews 11, this is a good example of faith, that Sarah was past the ability to have children. But she had to have faith because she had to say, well, God has to be the one to do it, because I know that my body cannot normally reproduce and have children at this age, that she was barren. Right? So that's a good example of faith. Sarah's not able to change anything about her situation or do anything. She just has to trust what God has said. Okay, so Isaac is born in chapter 21. Okay, a few other things go on there. There's a separation from of Hagar and Ishmael, Abraham's other son, go away. And then there's some covenants made with a local king named Abimelech. Abraham again lies and says that that Sarah is his sister. Similar situation. So he's not fully trusting God yet. Okay, now I want to point out something that's going to be really obvious, okay, but I think it will be helpful to state the obvious here. Okay, Genesis 21, Isaac is born. What is the next chapter after Genesis 21, numerically? Eli?
22.
Genesis 22, yes. Now I know it sounds obvious. We know that 21 comes after 20, or 22 comes after 21. But you have to see it in how the Bible lays it out. Even though there's some years in between, the promise is finally fulfilled after all this time. Ladies. Promise is finally fulfilled after this time. But the next thing that God tells Abraham to do in terms of how the Bible's laid out here is sacrifice Isaac. Kill him. And this now raises, not for God, but in Abraham's mind, and in ours, if we didn't know what happens here, a bunch of problems, a bunch of seeming inconsistencies, problems of God's promise, problems of God's nature and character, of what we know God to be like and what God approves and disapproves of and his standard. And so now we're at kind of a place that's where Abraham's faith is going to finally come to maturity. And that's what Genesis 22 demonstrates. Okay, so what is going on here in Genesis 22 verse 1? What is God's goal or intention with this episode or this event? God calls him to sacrifice Isaac, but what is God trying to accomplish? What does it say in Genesis 22:1? Yeah.
It's testing Abraham?
Yeah. Look at Genesis 22:1. It says, "Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am." So this is kind of the final test of Abraham's faith to see, is he really going to fully surrender to God and believe what God has said and trust God to do it all, trust God to provide, trust God to handle everything, even if Abraham does not understand, doesn't know what's going on, doesn't seem to make sense with the other things that God has said and what God is like and what God is trying to accomplish in the world. Now look at, somebody read for us Genesis 22, verse 2. Macy.
He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you."
Okay, so now God tells him, take Isaac, go to the mountain that I'm going to show you, kill him, offer him as a burnt offering. What problems does this seem to raise? We know they're not problems for God, but what things, would be in your mind?
The problem that Isaac is his only son, and he was promised that he would have many nations and a lot of
Yeah, that's probably, I think, the biggest problem, is now God seems to be working at cross purposes with what God has promised. Abraham has not seen the fullness of the promise of the land. He has not seen the fullness of the promise of blessing to the nations. He has not seen his family become a nation. The only promise that God has given him that gives him faith or confidence about these other things is that he's had one son. Okay? Now God says, kill him. I mean, that's a huge deal as far as this doesn't seem to fit with God's promise. What else is what other problems does this raise? For Abraham, for Isaac, for Sarah, for us, as if you were first reading this and didn't know what happened, what problems does this raise in addition to it seems that God's going to abandon his promise?
That God doesn't, it would contradict God, because God, like you said, God doesn't, he doesn't, lie, I guess.
Yeah. They would contradict God. That God is now contradicting himself. And if God's inconsistent with himself, then he can't be trusted. The other thing, this is why unbelievers hate this story. Even though they're, in a lot of cases, okay with killing people in different ways. But anyway, they dislike this story because they say, well, this doesn't seem right, what God is asking Abraham to do. And they've got a point, right? God's not okay with taking your child and sacrificing them. That's not what God commands in his law later on. God condemns the nations for worship of the god Molech, where the people offered their children and made them pass through the fire and die before this god Molech, right? And some of the kings and people of Israel did that, and that brought pretty severe judgment from God. So this doesn't seem to fit with who God is and what God commands in his standard. Yeah. Okay. So now, but notice how specific God is. Let's take it phrase by phrase in Genesis 22:2. He doesn't just say, take your son. Notice what he says. Let's somebody read and stop at each comma. What does God say at first? He said,
What chapter again?
Genesis 22. Okay, Sophia?
Take now your son,
Okay, pause there. So now your son, and then what's the next thing he says?
your only son,
Your only son. Okay, now the next phrase.
whom you love.
Whom you love, and then find Isaac. Yeah, he narrows it down. Abraham knows who he's talking about. However, God is very specific. He does not allow any room for interpretation here or alternatives, or that Abraham misunderstands who he is talking about. He says, your son only has, he does have another son. He has Ishmael, right? But this is in his mind as his son. And then he zeroes in, your only son, the only one that God has given him, the only son of promise. Okay? And then whom you love. Meaning Abraham is not indifferent to Isaac. It's not like he just thinks of this as like, okay, well, God's just going to work it out and I don't care what happens. That this is, he loves his son. This is his only son, his only heir, and now he's being asked to kill him. And then he says, Isaac. Okay, so you know the one that I mean, Abraham. And so he tells him to go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. But where does he tell him to go? What geographic location? And I know this may not seem like a big deal to us, but I want to highlight something there. Yeah.
The mountain of which fire God shall tell.
Okay.
Looks like a mountain.
Right, the mountain, but where's the region? Yeah.
Moriah.
Yeah, Mount Moriah. Okay. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal to us. Okay. It's like, okay, yeah, he tells him to go to Mount Moriah. But Mount Moriah is later where the temple is going to be constructed. And the temple is going to be the place where God's presence dwells with his people and sacrifice is made and atonement is made. So we have this developing this idea of theology and sacrifice and God's need for God's provision and faith and God's promises being tied together here. This is also in the location where Jesus later will die on the cross. Not exactly in the same spot, but this is this location where God is going to have sacrifice become a focal point and take place. Okay? And you can even think of, in the sense of, remember that the seed of the woman is going to have his heel crushed. There is going to be sacrifice that takes place in order to have victory over sin and the serpent. Okay? So, we have these elements here tied together. Now let me read ahead for us in Genesis 22:3. It says, So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place God had told him. On the 3rd day he raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Okay, so Abraham, we don't hear what he says. We don't know exactly what he's thinking. But he does respond. He is being obedient in what God has told him to do. Okay, so he goes on. But notice, and we'll finish up here, because we got to quit here and pick this up next time, because we've got chapel today. But let me read us Genesis 22:5. It says, Abraham said to his young man, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Okay? What's the thing that we should pick up on there? Yeah.
We're going to worship.
That's true. But after that, he says something funny if he's going to kill Isaac. We're going to worship and we're going to come back. That his idea, he knows God is going to do something, but he doesn't know what. And so his idea is, I don't know if he's going to kill Isaac, Isaac is going to raise from the dead, or God's going to do something that Abraham can't even think of. But he says, we're going to worship, we're both going to come back. Now Abraham is really being, I can imagine, tested here because he doesn't know, he hasn't experienced that that's going to be the case yet. Okay, so we'll see how that works out. But then Isaac even asks in 22:7, Dad, we have all the equipment for the sacrifice, but we're missing the one thing that makes a sacrifice a sacrifice. We're missing the animal. We're missing the lamb for the sacrifice. And Abraham says in 22:8, the Lord himself will provide a sacrifice, meaning God has to provide it. I can't do anything here. So this would be an exercise of faith on Isaac's part as well. Okay, it's 9:18.